going to show you how to make the Patriotic Bunting from Kreative Kiwi. For this I'm going to be using a 5x7 hoop, a layer of cutaway stabiliser, my squizzers, a sharp pair of fabric scissors, some threads, pins and my fabrics and batting cut to size. I've also got some thin gross grain ribbon, and that's for the little tabs that will be used to hang it. You'll find a link for this design in the video description below, along with lots of other information that you might find useful, so do please take the time to have a look. Load whichever letter and size you want into your machine. I'm going to go with the letter A today, and then you're going to hoop your layer of cutaway stabiliser. So place it over the outer hoop frame. Place your inner hoop frame over the top and push it together. You're now going to pin around the top edge of your hoop to stop your stabiliser being pulled down between the two pieces. So take your pin, rest it on the inside of the hoop, push it through your stabiliser and then bring it back round and through again, and that will anchor it. Load your neutral thread into your machine, and then you're going to stitch round number 1, and that's going to give you your placement outline for your batting. Place your batting over the outline and tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 2 to secure it, and you'll also get your fabric placement lines as well. Trim away the excess batting from around the edge of the stitch line. You're now going to start adding your fabrics to the bottom of the pennant, and we're going to start off with the middle one. So I cut mine into a strip and I just cut off what I need. So place this in the middle over this area here and then tape it in place. You need to leave some seam allowance on this, about 1/2 inch is fine. And once it's taped in place, you're then going to stitch round number 3, and that's going to secure it to the hoop. Trim up the excess fabric on each side of the stripe. You want to leave the top and bottom for now. You want to leave about 1/4 inch seam allowance each side. Take your red fabric, and we're going to work our way out and then across the other side. Again, place it over this area here. This time you want to line this edge up to the edge that you've just trimmed up, but it needs to cross this stitch line. And then I'm going to trim off my piece of fabric and tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 4, and that's going to stitch down this edge here, and then afterwards we're going to flip our fabric out to cover the next stripe. Remove your tape, and then you're going to flip your fabric back over this area here, and this is called the flip and stitch method, in case you were wondering. And then just run your nail over the join just to crease it thoroughly, and then place a little bit of tape top and bottom to hold it in place. Then you're going to pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 5 to secure it. We're now going to trim up the excess along this edge here. Place your white fabric again over this stitch line here, covering the area that you've just added. and then trim it off. And you want to make sure that your fabric comes at least 1/2 inch past this point here. So tape it in place, pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 6, and that's going to join it along here. Once again, we're going to trim up the excess a little bit on this side, and then you're going to fold this back and finger press it with your nail. A little tip for you: if you find that you've got this stitching showing through after you've added your fabric, it's because your stabilizer isn't doing its job properly. You need an extra layer. If it's holding properly, you won't see anything and it'll just look like an invisible join. So once you've folded that back, tape it down, pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 7. We're now going to trim up the excess along here. Place your red fabric over this stitch line here, and you want the edge this side, of course, and then trim off what you need. Tape it in place, then pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 8 to secure it. Trim up the excess along the edge here, flip your fabric back, and tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 9. That's going to secure it, then it's going to travel all the way along here so that we can do the same on the other side. This time you're going to place your fabric so that this edge sits over this stitch line here and covers the center stripe, and then tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 10 to secure it. We're now going to trim up a little bit of the excess off of the raw edge. Flip it over and crease it with your nail, and then tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 11 to secure it. Trim up some of the excess from the raw edge. Place your white fabric so that the edge covers this stitch line here, and tape it in place. Trim off any excess that isn't required. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 12 to secure it. Trim up your excess a little from the edge. Flip your fabric over, crease the join, and then tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 13 to secure it. Trim up the excess fabric from the side. Place your final red piece so that it crosses this stitch line here, and tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 14. Trim up the excess on the raw edge, flip it over and crease with your nail, and then tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 15. Load your thread colour for the satin stitch of your letter into your machine, And then you're going to stitch round number 16, and that's going to give you your placement outline for the fabric. Place your fabric for the letter over the outline and then tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 17 to secure it. We're now going to trim up around the edge of the letter, and because this is the letter A, there's a centre to trim out as well. So take your stitch unpicker and very carefully just slip it underneath your letter fabric. You don't want to cut your stripes underneath, and then just give it a tiny little slit, enough to get your scissors in, and then we can trim around the edge. And you want to cut quite close to the stitch line because the satin stitching is quite narrow compared to a border satin stitch on this letter. And now for the outside. You're now going to pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 18, and that's going to zigzag the raw edges of your letter. If you're happy that there's no threads poking through the zigzagging, you can now stitch round number 19, and that's going to do the satin stitch border around your letter. Now that your letter's all stitched, we're now going to trim up this the excess from the top here. So I'm going to turn my hoop around, and again you just want to leave a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So once you've done that, we're now going to place our fabric for the top. You're going to place it face down with your raw edge overlapping this stitch line here, and then tape it in place. Pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 20, and that's going to secure it. Remove your tape, and then you're going to trim up the excess from along the edge here, leaving about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance as before. And then you're going to flip your fabric up and tape it in place. I've swapped out my thread for a white so that you can see what I'm stitching. You're now going to pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 21 to secure it. Load your thread colour for the stars into your machine, and then you're going to stitch round number 22. We now come to adding these little tabs to hang the pennant from a cord. So take your piece of gross grain ribbon or whatever it is that you're going to be using, and I'm going to turn this around so that I can see what I'm doing. And you want to place them towards the outside of your pennant. You also want to make sure that they're all at the same distance down, and you're going to place the folded edge towards the centre of your pennant. So fold it in half, then pick a point to align it to, and you're going to align every single one that you do to the same point so that it all hangs nice and straight once you've completed it, and then tape it in place. And then do exactly the same with the other piece, and try and get it straight so that it hangs straight that way. Okay, I'm going to place a little bit more tape just for good measure on the tips. Then you're going to pop it into your machine and stitch round number 23, and that's going to secure it along the top stitch line here. I've removed all the tape from everywhere. We're now going to add the backing fabric, and you're going to place this face down over the top of your pennant, making sure that you cover all the stitch line, of course, and then you're going to tape it in place. Load your neutral thread colour into your machine, and I'm using the dark blue so that it blends with my blue fabric here. And then you're going to stitch round number 24, and that's going to stitch from here to round about here, and it's going to leave a gap for us to turn this out the right way afterwards. So that's all our stitching completed. You can remove all the pins from around the edge of your hoop and any tape, and then we're going to free this from the hoop. I'm going to turn this over. We're now going to trim away the excess stabiliser from around the edge, because that's going to get in our way when we come to trimming up the edges. And we're going to trim right up to the stitch line, taking care of course not to cut the actual stitch line. Next, you're going to want a pair of really sharp scissors, and you're going to trim around the edge of your bunting, leaving 1/4 inch seam allowance and a little bit more here. So first off, I'm going to trim down to within 1/4 inch of the stitch line there, and where the other side to this opening is, and then we're going to cut all round the edge. I'm going to trim up this level with the other side. And next we're going to snip diagonally across the corners, so that when we turn it we haven't got any bulk and the corners will poke out nicely. Just don't snip your stitching. And down on the bottom corner here we're going to snip in towards the stitch line for exactly the same reasons, but don't snip your stitch line, of course. I'm going to do the same on the angle here where it bends round. Okay, so now we're going to turn this out the right way. It's fiddly, but keep at it. Okay, so I'm now going to use a chopstick and poke that down inside just to push the ends out. Don't push so hard that you end up pushing it right the way through though, because otherwise you're going to have to go to your sewing machine to sort the problem out. Now going to go and press this. All lays nice and flat, and then I will be stitching up this gap here. So I pressed my bunting, I closed up the little gap here with some whip stitching by hand. There was a little white knot on here where I had stitched the top with white thread so that you could see it. So to disguise it, I just used a blue Sharpie pen and just touched it up so that it can't be seen. So when you stitch your top fabric, make sure that you use a thread that's going to blend completely in with your fabric. I hope you enjoyed this stitch along. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified of new videos as soon as they're published. Do pop along to Kreative Kiwi's Facebook group. There's lots of ideas, help and inspiration there for everybody. And thank you very much for joining me. There's a link to this design in the video description below, along with lots of other information such as where I get my supplies and also some discount codes for you.